this computer. Hi, everybody. Those of you who are joining, I see there are a few. We're going to give everybody just a couple of minutes longer to join, and then we'll get going. Thanks for being here.
Happy snow day, everyone. I hope you're enjoying it. Hope you didn't get stuck too bad today. I am stuck in trying to get out of Taos, and fortunately just made it up the hill and then got to where I was going. But I think, what's that?
One of our attendees, Lynn, says she got about 15 inches out on the mesa. So yeah, wow. Lynn, our board treasurer. Yikes, Lynn. I understand one of our other employees, Maya, who lives in San Cristobal, she said 18 inches earlier today.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is a blessing. I mean, just so long with so little moisture, and so hopefully we all got our cover crop seed in the ground in time. I'm sure not everyone did.
Oh, yep, David Gilroy, 18 inches in San Cristobal. Wow. And his seed is in, he says. Yay.
All right. Wow. Good job, Dave.
So I'm Susan and I'm just the moderator, but I want to tell everybody who's a participant that Ben and Chris will be doing the presentation. I'll be here to monitor questions. So if you have questions for Ben or Chris during this presentation, type them in the chat or the Q&A, and I will ask them when through the presentation, you know, and I hope to interrupt them with a question, one of your questions that makes sense with what they're talking about. So with that, guys, I think you can probably start, and I'll mute myself for now.
Okay, thank you, Susan, for moderating and making this all happen for us. Welcome, everyone. This is part 2 of our Healthy Soils webinars, COVID style. So I think some of you may have attended part 1, but we're continue along in the same vein. My name is Ben Wright, and Chris Pieper is also presenting with me today. And we're gonna cover a little different material than we did in the first webinar, cover crops, no-till seeding, and then those techniques applied on small farms and home gardens. So yeah, this just describes a little bit about what we covered in the first webinar. So we talked about soil testing and different techniques, thanks to Amy Larson from NMSU Alcalde. And we also talked about Johnson Sioux bioreactors and the benefits of that type of composting system. And then we talked about ways of applying this compost. And you're going to see what we're going to go into this time. So I'm the land manager for Taos Land Trust, Rio Fernando Park. And this will be a little bit of a review, and many of you may be familiar with this site, but basically this is a piece of property that is adjacent to Baca Park off of La Posta Road. And it's owned and managed by the Taos Land Trust, and we're doing a whole variety of things, and this little map shows some of what that variety is. But you know, this is a little unusual activities for a land trust, but in this case, you know, we're really trying to take seriously the community aspect of the work that we do with land conservation. And so a lot of these projects are very involved with educational programming and working with youth crews. And, we're really interested in treating this land like a laboratory where we can experiment with different techniques, but also really fully engage with the possibilities for both ecological restoration and agricultural restoration. This is farmland that basically wasn't farmed for a long period of time, possibly 30 years or so. And, so when we first acquired the property, there was quite a bit of work to do. And so over the last 4 years or so, we're well underway. The areas that we're going to talk about today are grain field number 1, grain field number 2, the pollinator habitat, and then also to some extent the future orchard. And that's where we're doing kind of the larger scale healthy soils work. But there's also some vegetable gardens going on in this area. And then this is the Rio Fernando running through the property. And that area is in the process of ecological restoration projects. So more detail. And then, of course, Chris is with us from Flourish Farm. And why don't you tell us a little bit about what you're working on, Chris?
Okay, well, thank you, Ben. So this is a picture from years ago. And when we first got started gardening, the approach was to till, to double dig, and not a lot of emphasis on cover cropping. Compost, we added a lot of compost. And for the first few years, we had really good harvests. We didn't have that much weed pressure to speak of. And as you can see from this photo, I was very proud. It was a very clean garden. There's garlic in the background there, the greenhouse in the background. But after some years of tilling, adding compost, we started getting more weed pressure. Our plants started showing signs of stress. And my response was just to add more compost. And but we continued to get declines. And about 3 years ago, we started trying no-till. We had tried no-till about 10 years ago, but we didn't really know what we were doing. We didn't incorporate cover cropping to speak of. And then a few years ago, we really focused on cover cropping, and the results have been spectacular. We had virtually no insect pressure this year, very few weeds, and we had a good harvest. So what I'm excited about is the fact that this works, and it, we can speak from direct experience. And in a time when there is no real positive news, this is my positive news. And this has been our hope for the future is that this can be scaled up to the scope of the planet. And, healing the soil, we can restore better climate on the earth. We can rehydrate the earth, and there's so many benefits to it. But anyhow, I'm excited to share the particular techniques that we used. And so there you go. That's the introduction.
Where is your farm, Chris?
It's up in Arroyo Seco. So it's about a half a mile from the Abominable Snow Mansion. And we supply goat cheese to the Love Apple. We sell some goat cheese direct to customers through mostly Mud and Flood, but some people come directly to the farm. And we're expanding we're going to obtain a couple of pasture pigs, Idaho pasture pigs. They're pigs that don't root and that can survive on pasture. And so that's going to be in the spring. We have that plan. So we're expanding.
Okay, well, let's get into some more detail.
Yeah, go ahead and go to the next slide.
So for this, okay, there's a little delay, so we have to be patient, I suppose. So the reason for this presentation is that the Land Trust received some funding to do healthy soils projects. And so I just wanted to share a little bit about the New Mexico Healthy Soils Program. And I'm not going to read this for you because I'm sure you're all capable of reading yourselves. But basically, the legislation that occurred allowed for many farmers, including the Land Trust and many other people around the state, to work on their soils through some of these techniques that have been tried in different places all over the world. And, you know, so really it's looking at changing ways that have led to a lot of degradation of soil, and a lot of inefficiencies in water use and those kinds of things. And so New Mexico is really putting some money behind finding better ways to do it. So exactly what does that look like? These are the general principles for healthy soils. And so all of our work, and then, you know, Chris is very well acquainted with this, I'm sure, but these are techniques for reviving the biology in the soils, which you stronger and healthier plant growth. And to some extent, I mean, we're all trying to do all of these as much as we possibly can. And, you know, they all go hand in hand. But, you know, a lot of the goals are based around serving these principles. And those goals at Rio Fernando Park, and, you know, this is what we've been doing since last spring. I mean, we actually started before then, but we've had the ability to really put a lot of effort into it this year. But really interested in, I mean, just like we're doing ecological restoration in the wetlands, we're interested in supporting a healthy ecosystem in our agricultural lands. And so regenerative agriculture is about working within natural systems and natural cycles to grow crops and food. So these were more of our particular goals for what we were trying to accomplish at Rio Fernando Park. And, you know, the goal obviously is to maintain these systems so that they're self-regenerating and they don't require a lot of inputs over time. And these are the techniques. So no-till is really important to the work that we do. So we're not turning the soil over, we're not disking it. We did some keyline plowing, which is a form of tilling. It's a deep channel through the soil, which allows for more infiltration, but it doesn't disturb the soil profile. So it's basically a one-time tilling, at least I think it's one time, but it's maintaining the soil profile. But these other techniques, they're ongoing. And, you know, even after this, this cycle of work, we're going to continue next year. And, you know, hopefully 10 years down the line, we'll still be doing type of work. So really, this is a long-term project. It's not just, you know, set it and forget it. One time it's done. This is ongoing applications of some of these techniques. And we're going to talk more about some of them today. And so Chris and Flourish Farms had their own take on how to approach these principles. Take it away, Chris.
Okay, all right. Well, here's a picture of our farm. In the background, you can see our barn where this was taken a few years ago. We have goats, and we have a pasture that we maintain, and we try to rotationally graze the pasture to the best that we can. And then we incorporate small amounts of compost into the garden. Next slide, Ben. Next slide. There we go. So
it's just a little slow.
There's a little delay there. That's fine. So I recently heard somebody use the analogy of flour and bread to tilled dirt and living soil. So flour has a lot of the same properties that heavily tilled ground does. It's hydrophobic, which means it repels water. It really doesn't act as a sponge. It's more compact. There's not a lot of airspace in it. Healthy soil has like 66% airspace in it. And there's not a lot of, in the case of flour, there's very little in terms of biology that's in there. Next slide. So you can see this is actually from our neighbor's pasture. I just picked up some dirt. And this dirt, as you can see, it lacks structure. It's very floury. If I was to pour water on it, it would run off. It wouldn't absorb readily. And a healthy soil can absorb up to like 10 inches of rain per hour. And that's the case up on Gabe Brown's ranch up in North Dakota. That's called infiltration rate. And so really what we're trying to do with these healthy soils is to capture as much precipitation as we can and hold it. Next slide. So there's some healthy soil. You can see it's got good structure. It's holding together. It's got some living roots in it. And some of the statistics that have come out recently about the biology in soil are extraordinary. 1 cubic inch of soil contains about 6 miles of fungal mycelium. It's like the root hairs of the fungus. It contains billions of microorganisms and very, very much alive. And it's the biology that is driving this. These are literally like underground cathedrals, underground cities. Next slide. And here's some of my wife's sourdough bread. Good bread has a lot of airspace in it. It's a product of biology, of both bacteria and yeast, which is a fungus. And it's something that's very healthy. And this sourdough was made from some wheat that was locally grown up in Cerro by Daniel Hutchinson. So we were very proud to buy some wheat from Daniel and start making bread. Next slide. So what we found on our farm in practice is that and I'll just read this, the presence of green plants is the most important factor for soil health. You can build good, healthy soil structure much more efficiently with the photosynthesis of green plants, as opposed to adding compost, which is something that we have done in the past. I'm not discouraging people to add compost. We still add compost, but we add much smaller amounts of compost. And what we found is that if you add too much compost, which is what we used to do, the soil becomes constipated. It can't process all those nutrients all at once. Next slide. So here's a picture that was taken a few days ago of one of our beds that has a cover crop mix that's nearing maturity, the point at which we'll harvest it and feed it to the goats. And you can see in there's some Swiss chard, there's some different species of grasses, there's some legumes, there's some brassicas, about 15 different species of plants. And each plant, as I'm sure Ben has discussed in the past, has its own unique cocktail of what we call exudates. These are sugars that the plant excretes into the soil, feeding its own unique ecosystem. Each plant has its own unique bacteria. You could say akin to our gut microbiome. Each plant has its own microbiome. So as they say, diversity above ground equates to diversity below ground. Next slide. So here's just a picture that illustrates the importance of these root exudates. It's something I would encourage all of you to do some research on your own, because it's a fascinating topic. And I was listening to David Johnson. He was the inventor of the Johnson-Su, along with his wife, the Johnson-Su bioreactor. And one thing he mentioned that really stuck with me is that when plants are growing in a more degraded soil, a soil that doesn't have a developed structure, the majority of the sugars produced through photosynthesis will go into the soil, feeding the livestock below ground. And that as the soil becomes more mature and healthy, more of those sugars will be used by the plant itself in its above ground growth. Next slide.
Well, that's really cool, Chris. So what we're seeing is that by having living plants growing in the soil, you're actually attracting the microbes, which in turn support the plants. So you're kind of setting into motion a cycle that really allows for this community of different organisms to function at its highest possible level. And so I think a lot of our efforts are to really invigorate this cycle. And so that's where we get into cover crops. And so really the cover crops, if you think back to the soil health principles, it's really important for number one, covering bare ground, no bare ground. So there's no, the cover crop, you're basically root in the ground. So really, this is really to be taken seriously. Like the idea of a fallow field is against the principles of healthy soils, because really you want something growing through the fall and winter and early spring, and then you can have your crop. But you really want to keep that soil biology alive by having living plants at all times. Yes.
Sorry.
It's okay. I'm listening.
One of our participants is asking, Mary Jo wants to know, are there certain plants that are better for cover crops, like clover or any green plants? Are you going to be getting into that?
Yeah, I will get into that a little bit more, yes.
Okay, thanks.
The answer is yes. And there's a lot of detail that could be gained, but I'll cover that at least an introduction to it. So besides feeding the soil food web, as I discussed, once you have that cover crop, you are also going to make much better use of your water. And so that goes with acequia use or drip irrigation or rainfall, or any way other possible that you get water on your land. And I just think that that's a really key part of this. New Mexico and trying to grow plants, we have found that water is very much of a limiting factor, and so we want to make the best use of it possible, because there's a limited quantity of it. And then also, as we're experiencing at Rio Fernando Park, we have quite an onslaught of invasive and undesirable species, and we would like to outcompete them. And it's ongoing. and we've had some success. We certainly have better success when we have wetter years, but the cover crops are really important to all of these things, as Chris described, and we're putting into practice at Rio Fernando Park as well. So this maybe helped to answer Joanne's question. What makes a good cover crop? And really, people use the word diversity so often. Sometimes it's hard to track what it means, but it is really, really important. And we're looking at different types of plants to serve these different functions. And then we're also looking at what those plants do in their lives in the soil. So really, a cocktail of cover crop seed will serve many of these different functions through the different types of plants engaged. So we're looking at legumes for nitrogen fixing, and that includes clovers and vetches, anything in the legume family, basically. And it's not the plants that actually do nitrogen fixing. It's actually the plants that attract the microbial community through their root zones that do the chemistry of converting atmospheric nitrogen into a form of nitrogen that the plants can then take up. So there's those bacteria again working hard. It's also good to in your cover crop to have deep-rooted plants, and I'll get into it in a little bit, but the roots go down deep and they break up compacted soil, and they also open pore space. And as Chris mentioned, I mean, it's not the soil that is as important as people describe that the grains of soil are just as important as the spaces in between them, and that's for air to move through there, and for water to move through there, and for the lives of these little microbes to exist in these spaces. So, really a good soil will have pore space and room for it to breathe. So cover crop also feeds the microbes, and that's speaking to the exudates that Chris was describing. The microbes need to eat something, and the symbiotic associations are created by having that food to eat. And then another thing that's important is pollinators and other insect habitat. There's a lot of beneficial insects that serve various functions amongst our plants, and we really need to think about them in our cover crop cocktails. It's also important to think about when we plant, the timing of it, because different plants will thrive at different times of year. For example, I wouldn't be planting buckwheat in the fall because it simply won't germinate. There's a possibility it would germinate when the soil's warm, but it's not a good winter crop. Whereas something like vetch or the winter wheats, those will germinate in the fall, and they will remain subdued through the winter under snow cover, but then with all that moisture, they will come back strong in the spring. And so really, when you're thinking about a cover crop, and this is for many different cases, this image shows our garden beds at Rio Fernando Park, so pretty small scale, but you really want to think about serving all these functions. And there are some tools to help a person figure out what the cocktail might be. Green cover seed, if you Google green cover seed, you'll find their smart mix calculator. And that it's really simple, but it basically gives some suggestions for what your cover crop cocktail might be. And another tool might be to just call some of the local seed companies and just talk to them about what you're trying to do. Some of them are quite versed in good cover crops. I'm thinking of Great Basin Seed Company and Pawnee Buttes. Those are the two that I've used here, but there's others in the region. So there are a lot of resources for how to develop your cover crop cocktail. And, I think we talked before everyone came on about providing some resources for everyone, and maybe we can include some of that information and resources that will get emailed out to you all. And so this is what we did. So we seeded approximately 6 acres plus the vegetable growing beds with this seed mix. And if you remember the map, we had 2 acres of one kind of grain, 2 acres of another kind of grain, and then pollinator habitat. So right at the bottom, you'll see cereal rye, winter wheat, or native wildflowers and grasses. That's what refers to the 3 different. Those are our I don't know if I'd call them cash crops, but those are our desired crops that we may harvest. Not the wildflowers and grasses, but definitely the rye and the winter wheat. Those are harvestable crops. Everything else is serving to build the soil biology, which will then our crops do as well as they possibly can. So if you look at this list, we have winter peas, that's a legume, doing the work of attracting nitrogen-fixing bacteria. We have turnips and daikon radishes, which are doing the work of breaking up the compacted soil. Hairy vetch is also a legume. The rape seed is also a legume. The triticale is a grain, and like the rye and the winter wheat, they are really good at producing the exudates, which attract the healthy soil bacteria and fungi. Don't forget about the fungi. So this is the mix that we came up with, and depending on what your goals are and what you're following with your other crops, this will change, but these are pretty reliable in this region. And what are you doing, Chris?
Okay. So in this picture here on the left, one thing I would add to that list, Ben, is all those cover crops that you had are also good for livestock. And so for us at our farm, just before, right at the point at which, the plants are flowering, we harvest them and we feed them to the goats. So we add in there, we make sure that we choose cover crop seeds that are good forage for the goats. The chickens also eat it, and the geese. So in this picture here, what I have is on the right side, I planted some cover crop seed. I basically scatter it right on the surface, and then I cover it with a thin layer of compost. And then I cover that with some shade cloth, and I water it in deeply. And the shade cloth really helps with germination, especially when our relative humidity drops. We get a lot of evaporation. And so I would encourage people you can also cover with some light straw, but in those initial stages where you're trying to get good germination, you want to keep it moist. And then on the left side there, we've got a mix that's real similar to the one that you went over. We added some collard greens into that. We had daikon like you did, a couple different species of grass, annual grasses. All in all, about 15 different species. And this was a mix that we got from green cover seed as well. So right at about this stage, we harvest it, we feed it to the goats. Next slide. And then in some cases, like we harvested some wheat in our garden. We threshed it and we separated it and we made some bread from it. And after I harvested the wheat, I didn't hoe the soil or till it in any way. I just removed it down to about, an inch of the topsoil. And then I scattered more cover crop seed, covered that with some compost. And you can see these are little brassicas that are growing up, and some clovers that are growing up through the the wheat, and you can see the wheat stalks, you know, in different parts of the picture there. Next slide.
Hey, Chris and Ben.
Yeah.
We have a question from David Gilroy. He wants to know if either of you have any experience with annual alfalfa for deep rooting nitrogen fixation.
I do not.
I do not either.
Oh.
That's interesting. That would be something to look into, though, for sure.
Okay, thanks.
So in this picture here, I had a bed of cover crop, and we wanted to follow up with planting garlic, which we did about a week ago. And so in this case, I did harvest the cover crop, which I fed to the goats, and then to remove the small stalks and just to break up the roots, I did use a wheel hoe. And so there is some disturbance here, but I'm careful that it doesn't penetrate much deeper than about an inch. And that's just to ensure that I don't get a lot of those cover crops regrowing into the garlic bed. So it's not a zero disturbance garden. There is some disturbance. I just don't use a rototiller. Next slide. So in our garden, if planting with a cover crop, I go ahead and I harvest leaves from our neighbors, from Kit Carson Park, from our own yard, and I cover those beds with leaves. And we find that that's really important to keep the soil covered. Having a cover crop is the ideal thing, but if you can't get around to planting the cover crop, then make sure that you cover the soil. Next slide. And another thing that we've discovered that works really well for us is that in the garden pathways, we layer wood chips and manure. And the reason that we put some manure in there is that it accelerates the breakdown of the wood chips. And it also acts as a sponge so that when we get larger rain events, that you know, the garden really soaks up that water, and some of that water is then available to the plants that are in the beds. And if you dig into these garden pathways, you find they're full of red worms and fungal mycelium. It's real active ecology in there. So I'm a huge proponent of using wood chips in garden pathways and around perennials. Next slide. So this brings me to the topic of mulching. And as I said, we layer wood chips and manure. And in some cases, we have actually created entire gardens using nothing but wood chips and manure. We don't till it in. We never till wood chips into the ground. That's a really key thing to understand when applying wood chips is you don't till them into the ground. You always leave them on the surface, replicating what happens in nature, like in a forest. And then adding the manure adds some nitrogen to that, and it provides more food for the microbes and earthworms. Next slide. And so I included this slide just to show people here in New Mexico, where we have very high evaporation rates, using mulch can really cool the soil down. And you'll notice that anywhere you put mulch, if you dig out the mulch a little bit, you'll find that there are a lot of earthworms. They like that, they like cooler soil. Microbes do much better. in soils that are up to about 80 degrees, but beyond like 85 degrees, microbial activity really drops off. And so the difference between bare soil and soil that is covered is enormous. And I think it's somewhere around 50% of agricultural soils on the planet are bare at any time, which leads to massive impacts on climate, both locally and globally. So covering the soil is really important. Next slide. So here's just an illustration with some temperature differences. If the outside ambient temperature is 105, the soil surface of a bare field can be up to 155 degrees. You know, at that temperature, it essentially kills all life that's in the soil. Whereas under a multi-species cover crop, the temperature would be around 77 degrees, because plants, through transpiration and also shading, actively cool the area right around the soil, creating the ideal environment for microbes to exist. Next slide. So here's an example of our wood chip garden. There's a guy named Paul Gauchi. He's a devout Christian who lives up in Washington State. And he is a huge proponent of gardening and wood chips. That's what he does. That's his approach to no-till. He doesn't use cover crops. He just uses wood chips, which in his area are super abundant, and some chicken manure from his chickens. And like I said earlier, he layers the wood chips and the manure, and over time you get a deep layer of rich humus. A lot of it is composed of earthworm castings. The critical thing, if somebody decides to do this method, which I do encourage, is that in New Mexico, you have to keep it moist, because as soon as it dries out, then decomposition will drop and the biological activity will drop also. So you've got to keep it moist. Within a couple of years, you should be ready to start planting. And this year, we harvested about 400 pounds of potatoes in this small patch, and very little weed pressure. We did have to contend with gophers, but just loaded with redworms and some earthworms. And it retains water really, really well. That's another thing about using wood chips. Next slide.
Chris?
Yeah.
Another question. Are there specific wood chips that you would recommend? Like, do you avoid evergreens, for example?
That's a great question. If I can get it, I do like deciduous trees. Cottonwood, willow, some elm, aspen are fantastic. But if you can't get deciduous trees, then evergreens I've found work fine. Even juniper has worked fine for us. And I get my wood chips from Tarzan's Tree Service. There's a number of tree services in town, and I buy them for $50 a load. And I specify to them, I say, hey, if you can get a load of this particular species of trees with leaves, even better, then please deliver to my house anytime. And so great question.
Nice, thanks.
I just want to add something. Part of what wood chips can offer, as opposed to other compost made from vegetable matter, for example, because fungi are very involved with trees and live in the tissue of trees. As the wood chips decay, fungi really take off. And so when you have wood chips used as your mulch and you're using it to basically compost in place, you're creating a very strong fungal community. And that's a, you know, especially if you're doing no-till approaches, I mean, that's really lends itself to a lot of other microbial activity. The fungi are often overlooked, and, you know, really for perennial systems, the fungi are very important. So the wood chips really help support that type of community.
Yeah, absolutely. That's what I found through a direct experience. Was there a question, Susan?
Nope, that takes care of all of them. Thanks, you guys.
Oh, okay, so this last slide here. So adding compost can be a really important part of keeping a diverse and healthy garden. But from our experience here, using cover crops, and as Ben said, keeping living roots in the soil, keeping that green cover is the most efficient way to build healthy topsoil. And these principles work. This is, you know, there are a lot of practices that in theory sound great. And I remember in theory, this sounded great. And when I put it into practice, even better. We found out that it worked. And another thing that I didn't add, and that Ben mentioned this earlier, is that the ecosystem of our farm, we've seen signs of, we have more snakes. It seems like our bird population is more diverse this year. And there are more pollinating insects and far fewer insects that would be considered pests, like aphids and other things. So really looking at the farm as an ecosystem, you know, the community extending beyond the plants that you're growing for food is a part of what we're trying to achieve through regenerative agriculture. Ben, anything you want to say there?
Yeah, I think those are some really good points, because, I mean, as we've experienced and just in critical of the way industrialized agriculture, which is basically, you know, seeing the soil as a resource to be used up, and you keep adding fertilizers, and you have a lot of inputs going into the soil to maintain the possibility that plants will grow. But over time, as we've experienced, you know, that way of feeding the soil leads to a lot of degradation and a lot of problems. And, you know, so by adopting techniques that are supporting the biology of the soil and the living plants, and really considering that you're not just growing the desirable plant, you're actually growing a whole community of organisms that lend itself to, that support that desirable plant that you're trying to grow as a crop. And, you know, so the advantages of that system is that this is long-term sustainable. It's regenerative because you're building soil health, you're improving the conditions that allow you to grow more plants over time. Rather than taking away the nutrients, you're adding to the nutrient pool that then gets grown into the plants, which leads to highly nutritious food, as we all know. And, you know, so I think it's a really good point that we're trying to actually recreate a natural process as best as we possibly can. I mean, not just recreate it, but actually maybe participate in it, because it's, you know, it's something that existed long before we began tinkering with it anyway. So, you know, we have a lot to learn just by looking at how the forest functions and how the prairie functions and how these plants function in more natural settings. And, we're trying to mimic that as best as we possibly can.
Hey, gentlemen, we've got another question. Our friend Tim Sweeney wants to know, when the time comes to replace the cover crop with the harvestable crop, what do you do with the cover crop? I know, Chris, you said you feed it to your livestock, but I'm interested in that too. And do you pull it all out, or do you leave the roots in? I'd like to know more.
That I'll go first, and you can talk more, Chris. That's an excellent question, Tim. And I didn't really go into it. I will a little bit shortly, but basically there's different techniques. And, if you remember, the last of the healthy soils principles is involve animals in your program. And it's not something we're doing at Rio Fernando Park, but I know that's something that Chris spoke about doing with his goats. So the living cover crop can be grazed. That's really the ideal. And you talk to Gabe Brown, and who's the farmer in North Dakota, and he'll say, really, that's the only way. And he firmly believes that animals need to be on the land. For various reasons, we're approaching it in different ways. So one of the things we're doing, because we have a rye crop in the ground serving as a cover crop, we want to terminate that crop, but we don't want to remove it. We want that crop to basically become microbial food even while it's being decayed. So we terminate it with a tool called a roller crimper, which basically lays it flat. Alternatively, the cover crop could be mowed before it goes to seed, and that's a way of terminating it. And in a lot of cases, and Chris showed an example of this, you can grow your desirable crop or your cash crop or whatever you want to call it right through the cover crop. And as the cover crop naturally dies off, then you have the crop that you want coming through it. So basically, you don't want to remove that crop. I mean, I guess, if you're using it for feed, that's one thing, but you want to have that crop become then the food for the future plants and the microbes in the soil. So you want to leave it in place and have it become the mulch, first a living mulch, and then a microbial decaying mulch. So I hope that at least partially answers your question.
Well, it's a very comprehensive answer. I would add one thing that we do, if we have a cover crop that for some reason the goats aren't eating, or is just not palatable, we'll cut it with a hand scythe, or we can mow it with a mower, and use that as a green mulch around perennial plants that you can just lay it right on the surface of the soil, and eventually the worms will come up and they'll incorporate that into the soil. So the last thing that you want to do is allow those plants to die above ground, and most of the carbon will oxidize, and you'll lose that Prussian carbon. And you, like Ben said, is you want to allow that plant, the dead plant, to become food for the microbial community and be incorporated into the soil. So an example of one thing we do, it's not a cover crop, but like we have a small lawn, and when I mow it, I take the grass clippings and I layer them very thinly. You want to layer them thinly, never too deep, because they can become like an anaerobic mat. You layer them thinly around perennial plants, and then you can put wood chips over that too. And one thing I wanted to mention too, Ben, that I didn't say before, is that years ago when we first started gardening, the adage was, you feed the soil to feed the plants. And now what I've come to realize is that plants feed the soil. And it's really through photosynthesis that you build healthy soil, and it's not by just adding compost every year like we used to think.
Terrific. Thanks, Chris and Ben.
And I would add too, Ben's mentioned a number of times community, that we're supporting the soil community. And many of us grew up with learning survival of the fittest, that nature is based on competition, that competition is what drives evolution. And that we've gone beyond that. Ecologists now recognize that it is cooperation that drives evolution and diversity. And that's one of the reasons why the more diversity of plants, animals, and insects that you have, the more resilient the ecosystem is going to be. And there have been studies done in Germany on diversity of cover crops, and they find essentially more the better, and so anyhow,
Wow.
wanted to end with that too.
Yeah, I wish some politicians were on this tonight.
Yeah.
The importance of diversity and not survival of the fittest. I'll be quiet now.
Yeah, and if people are interested in that, there's a woman named Lynn Margulis. She's now dead, but she was the first scientist to theorize and then prove that mitochondria was what she called an endosymbiont. That it evolved separately from the cell, and that they developed a symbiotic relationship. And the same with chloroplasts, the energy producer within the plant cell. And she theorized that it's symbiosis. We live in a symbiotic planet. It's not a planet based on this corporate model of competition and survival of the fittest. So Lynn Margulis, she was married for a brief time to Carl Sagan, and they were quite a pair. But there's a great documentary about her.
Yeah, I'm fond of her work as well, Chris. Thanks for going into that.
Yeah, she was a real pioneer.
So we have.
Yeah, go ahead, Ben. Sorry.
Oh, it's okay. Let's maybe we can talk some more. Let's just think. Yeah, we want to talk about no-till seeding. And so it's something that both Chris and I have brought up quite a bit. And you'll hear it a lot. Why is this important? And it's I think, Chris, you had a story about failure. What was your realization?
Ben, you cut out a little bit. A story about what? Ben, I didn't catch you there.
Looks like
techniques 10 years or so ago, and it didn't work so well.
Yeah, you're cutting out just a little bit. So it's about a story about the initial approach that didn't work so well.
Yeah.
Yeah. So if I didn't quite catch everything, but if I understand you correctly, that initially our approach was totally different. It was all based on tillage, and it I could say that as opposed to regenerative agriculture, it was degenerative agriculture. It just got worse and worse, our garden. And it wasn't until a few years ago that we started practicing no-till that we had huge improvements. And we used the no-till seeder from the Taos Land Trust to seed our field this last spring, and it dramatically improved the forage quality of the field. The field required less water. It remained green longer than adjacent fields. And we've done some initial soil tests, and the soil tilt has really improved as a result of the no-till seeding in the field.
Yeah, so no-till seeding, it's basically a way of treating the soil where you're not turning it over. I mean, that's pretty obvious. But the question is, why is that important? Why does it work? And as Chris touched on, it doesn't work if you're not working with a living mulch, a living cover crop. And so you have to combine the no-till with your living cover crop in order for the technique to work. But really, you're disturbing the soil structure as minimally as possible. And that's important because it allows for the soil structure to develop fully. And fungi in particular are very sensitive to tillage. And if you have a field that's being disked regularly or being tilled, you're not going to have very much fungal activity because simply put, the fungal hyphae don't even have the opportunity to grow. And as many people know, I mean, these strands, these filaments that are basically, the body of the fungus, not the fruiting body. The fruiting body is the mushroom, but the hyphae thread for many miles through the soil in some cases. And if you avoid disturbing that, you will have a lot more benefit from the fungi being in the soil. So that's one major benefit. Also, if you don't till, you're not going to compact the layers right below the tillage, because there's actually, if you look at soil profiles, you can see where the soil is compacted right at the very bottom of the depth of the plow, and that allows for pretty limited plant growth. So no-till techniques resist that. And then also with a porous soil structure, your infiltration will be much better. And Chris talked about that. So, I mean, I just kind of want to wrap up. So this is a no-till seeder at Rio Fernando Park, but no-till seeding doesn't have to happen with a fancy piece of equipment or a tractor. It doesn't really need to be done that way. I mean, you can do it in your little garden plot. And it's simply a way of approaching how you treat your soil rather than turning it over. And and I've done it for years. I mean, I've done the whole double digging thing, and it might be a way of starting off a garden bed, but once you kind of get the cycles into motion, you want to basically leave it alone and work from the top down rather than turning it over. And this is kind of revolutionary to farming. I mean, at least in my mind, it's, you think about the spring chore of turning the soil over so you can start your seed beds. And really there's another way, working with cover crops and no-till techniques that, I mean, we're experimenting with, and, we haven't fully engaged with the results yet, but it sounds like, Chris, you do have positive results from your experience on your farm.
Yeah, absolutely. And like you mentioned, we used to think that we had to till the soil and we had to have a real loose bed to plant the seeds in. And now we don't do that. We just scatter the cover crop seed right on the surface and then cover it with a thin layer of either compost or other soil. And it does not need to be complicated, and it does not require any kind of heavy machinery. We can do it in our small backyard gardens, no problem.
So that about wraps up the topics that we wanted to talk about. So if you have any questions that haven't already been answered or comments, feel free to type them in and Susan will relay them to us. And I just want to thank you all for attending this this workshop. And if you just ongoing over time, I mean, we're hoping, and I'm sure that Chris will back me up on this, that this is a community of ideas that is intended to share, and we're all learning from each other. So let's communicate with one another and learn what's working and what's not working. This is an ongoing project. So questions, Susan?
Not seeing any yet. We did have Mary Jo say that this was fantastic, and thank you.
You're welcome, Mary Jo.
Yeah, and Ben, I'd like to thank both you and Susan for putting this on and inviting me to be a participant. And Ben, thanks so much for all your work at the Taos Land Trust. So much of the success at our farm I can really attribute to the accessibility of the no-till seeder and your support over there. And I just want to emphasize how proud I am to have the Taos Land Trust in our community, really focusing on regenerative agriculture and land management. So thanks so much.
And thank you as well, Chris, for participating in this. I mean, I've seen some of your talks and in the community, and you're doing a lot of the work of getting the word for these techniques out there.
We're doing our best.
Yep.
So with that, oh, we might have another question. Let's see. Oh, nice. Well, Dave Gilroy, sweet Dave Gilroy says, thanks Ben and Chris for sharing stories and good ideas. Already looking forward to another spring seeding to add some diversity. Really appreciate,
right.
Yeah, really appreciate the drill seeder being available to us also.
Yeah.
So if anybody,
thank you.
Oh, sorry. If anybody comes up with questions between now and whenever, feel free to email us. You can email to info@taoslandtrust.org, to ben@taoslandtrust.org. But since Ben is so busy and often out in the fields, you might do better to send it to info or to Susan@taoslandtrust.org. Happy to answer questions. Oh, and this will.
Yeah, and they can send.
Go ahead.
Susan.
Go ahead, Chris.
Oh, my email is mudandflood@gmail.com. So that's muddnflood@gmail.com. They can email me as well.
Excellent, thank you. And this webinar has been recorded. Oh, let's see. Well, I'll finish that. This is being recorded, and once we edit it a little bit, we'll have it up on our website, and I'll be emailing that link to all of you as well, and anybody who signed up but wasn't able to attend. Tim Sweeney asks, for future communications, tell us how, oh, maybe he doesn't, I don't know if he means for me to ask this now, but how is Vigil Romo Acequia doing?
Well, the acequia is we're pushing to do our cleaning in the fall rather than the spring, because last year we noticed that the runoff was very early coming off the Rio Fernando. So right now I'd say the acequia is waiting for water. So we're going to rake up leaves and get it clean and get it ready for the early spring runoff. So besides that, it's hard to say how it's doing. I mean, it's soaking up the moisture from all the snow, I'd say. I do want to add that, and I mentioned this, we'll send some resources out to all of you. So you have some references, but yeah, so, and if there's particular information that you're not seeing in what we've sent, either from this workshop or the previous workshop, then feel free to email me or Susan. And thank you so much for caring about your soils. I mean, I think that this is kind of, it's really inspiring to see all this energy going into supporting healthy soils. And, you know, we just hope that this leads into, you know, more success in these areas. Do you have anything to close up with, Chris? You're muted.
Ditto on everything you just said. And I'd like to say too that in addition to, of course, the impact that this has on climate and to life on Earth, I think that we really need to wean ourselves entirely from getting food from industrial farms and take the initiative locally to grow food and not rely so much on larger farms, but we need more small farms, whether they're just backyard gardens or, you know, half acre, quarter acre, whatever. But I encourage as many people as possible to grow food.
Amen, Chris.
Hallelujah.
And one more
Well,
reminder
okay.
of the Mayordomo of Vigili Romo Acequia is that the annual cleaning is next Thursday, November 5th. Just an FYI.
Okay.
So thank you, Mayordomo. And with that, and thank you all for attending, much appreciated, and stay in touch. So with that, we'll end this session.
Good night, everyone.
Enjoy the snow.